Adrian Blackwell's name carried a weight that made boardrooms fall silent and rivals lower their gaze. He was the man who could dismantle a company with a single signature, the man who never lost, the man who turned cold logic into an empire. His office tower loomed above the city, all glass and steel, reflecting his reputation, untouchable, impenetrable, and merciless. To the world, Adrian was a force carved out of ice. Yet even men like him faced storms they could not fully control. The storm came in the form of a merger that could change the future of Blackwell Enterprises. The Langston family, old money and tradition, had what Adrian wanted, a legacy that would cement his empire as unshakable. But the Langstons demanded something he never anticipated: stability, respectability, and ties to a family name that did not reek of ruthless ambition. They wanted proof that Adrian could be more than a calculating shark. They wanted a wife by his side, someone who could soften his edges and assure them he was not just a predator circling their fortune. Adrian's mind turned, quick and relentless, searching for the answer. And then he found it. Not in the socialites who fluttered through his world with polished smiles, but in the quiet dignity of a woman who did not belong there at all. Isabella Hart. She was the daughter of a family who once held wealth but now struggled in silence. Their names still carried echoes of prestige, but beneath the surface was ruin, debts piling higher than they could manage, a crumbling estate, and whispered humiliation that followed Isabella's every step. She was modest, soft-spoken, and careful with her words, a young woman who seemed misplaced in a world that had chewed her family apart. Adrian saw her not only as a solution, but as a challenge. Her innocence was almost disarming, her quiet grace a sharp contrast to the glittering, empty women who pursued him. Their first meeting was not romantic. Adrian arranged it with the same precision he brought to hostile takeovers. He summoned her to his office, the top floor of his tower, where the skyline stretched endlessly behind him like a battlefield he had already conquered. Isabella entered cautiously, her plain dress at odds with the polished marble floors. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse, but her gaze, though hesitant, was steady. "You know who I am," Adrian said, his tone clipped, as though stating the obvious. "Yes," she whispered, her voice soft but carrying a strength that caught him off guard. He leaned back in his chair, assessing her. "Then you know I don't waste time. I need a wife, Isabella. Not for love, not for romance. For business, for appearances. It would be a contract. 1 year only. You will have security, your family's debts will vanish, and in return, you will stand by my side when the world is watching." Her lips parted in shock, and for a long moment she said nothing. He could see the storm in her eyes, the disbelief, the indignation, the flicker of fear. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap as though trying to hold herself together. "A contract marriage?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes." His answer was cold, final. "No strings beyond what the world sees. No expectations you don't agree to. You will be my wife in name, nothing more." Isabella's heart pounded. It was absurd, humiliating, terrifying. Yet beneath the horror was the quiet echo of her reality. The bills her father could not pay, the creditors who knocked at their door, the family legacy slipping through her fingers. She wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being told her to run from this man, from the icy grip of his offer. But desperation has a cruel way of silencing pride. Adrian watched her carefully, noting every flicker of hesitate. Every swallow of fear. Most women would have leapt at the chance to wear his name, to claim his fortune. Isabella was different. She sat there, silent, battling herself, her innocence laid bare. And in that moment, Adrian felt something he hadn't in years: curiosity. "Think carefully, Isabella," he said, his voice lowering, silk over steel. "This will change everything, for both of us." Her hands trembled as she finally lifted her gaze to his. Her eyes, though uncertain, carried the weight of her decision. "If I say yes, my family's debts will be gone?" "Yes." "And after 1 year, it ends?" Yes, he repeated, though for the first time he wondered if it truly would. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. Then Isabella drew a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. Then I accept. Adrian felt a sharp satisfaction coil within him, but beneath it, a strange spark ignited, something he could not name, something he was not prepared for. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers, and for the briefest moment, the ruthless CEO and the virgin bride sat across from each other, unaware that their carefully drawn boundaries were already beginning to blur. Isabella barely slept after that meeting. The walls of her small bedroom seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with the weight of what she had just agreed to. A contract marriage to Adrian Blackwell. The thought alone made her chest tighten. He was everything she had been warned about her entire life. Ruthless, cold, dangerous. Yet tomorrow, she would be walking into his world as his bride. Her mother's hopeful smile when Isabella told her about the arrangement haunted her. Her father's weary eyes, clouded by years of debts, looked relieved for the first time in years. Their salvation had come at a cost, and she was the one paying it. The day of their private contract signing was cloaked in tension. Adrian's penthouse was intimidating, its glass walls reflecting the city skyline. Isabella stood in front of the massive table where the agreement lay, her fingers brushing against the fine paper, her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. Adrian's presence filled the room before he even spoke. He looked immaculate, his tailored suit as sharp as the edge in his eyes. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Read it carefully, Isabella," he said, sliding the contract toward her. "Every clause, every line has been chosen to protect us both." She skimmed through it, the words swimming together in her anxiety. Appearances at corporate events, photographs together, family dinners staged for the press, 1 year of presenting themselves as the perfect couple. She noticed a clause that made her pause. No intimacy unless mutually agreed upon. Her cheeks flushed and she quickly averted her gaze, but Adrian's eyes caught hers. "That part was for you," he said, his voice softer but still unyielding. "You made it clear you wanted boundaries." The fact that he had respected that struck her, unsettling her more than his icy demeanor ever could. She signed with trembling hands, her name scrawled beside his. For a moment she felt as though she had signed away her freedom, yet when Adrian took the contract back, something in his gaze shifted, as though he too realized the magnitude of what they had bound themselves to. Their marriage was arranged quickly and quietly. Only a handful of guests present, all important to Adrian's world. Isabella wore a simple gown, her hair pinned delicately, her innocence shining through in a room of seasoned players. She felt the weight of every stare, whispers echoing behind her. Adrian stood tall beside her, his hand firm on hers, his expression unreadable. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Adrian leaned close, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered, "This is only the beginning." The first night in his mansion was the true beginning of their strange union. Isabella was shown to a grand bedroom across the Hecas, all from his. The sheer size of the room, the luxury surrounding her, only deepened her loneliness. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the hem of her gown, wondering what she had done. Across the hall, Adrian poured himself a drink, staring at the city below. For years he had built his empire on logic and control, but tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, his thoughts kept circling back to her. When he finally entered her room without knocking, Isabella's breath caught. He didn't touch her, didn't even step closer, but his gaze held her frozen in place. "Do not mistake this for anything more than business," he said, though his tone betrayed a faint edge of something else. Yet even as he spoke, he found himself studying the curve of her jaw, the way her hands gripped the blanket as if it were a lifeline. She lifted her chin, surprising him with her quiet defiance. "I understand, Mr. Blackwell, but business or not, I am not a possession." The words hung between them, sharp and unexpected. Adrian's eyes narrowed, but instead of anger, there was something else simmering. Interest, curiosity, and a spark of obsession he hadn't felt in years. When he finally left her alone, Isabella lay awake staring at the ceiling. Across the hall, Adrian couldn't sleep either. The contract was supposed to keep things simple. Instead, it had awakened a storm neither of them could control. The morning after their wedding dawned with a heavy silence that clung to the walls of Adrian's mansion. Isabella woke in her room to the sound of footsteps echoing down the marble hallways, a reminder that she now lived in a house that did not feel like hers. She moved cautiously, her simple nightdress flowing as she stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched endlessly below, but instead of freedom, she felt the weight of a gilded cage pressing against her chest. Adrian was already in the dining hall, his sharp suit in place, his expression as unreadable as ever. The long table was laid with silverware and delicate china, but only 2 seats were occupied. Isabella hesitated before sitting opposite him. He didn't look at her immediately. His attention remained fixed on the financial paper in his hand. When he finally set it down, his eyes found hers, cold yet searching. "The press will expect us tonight," he said. "A gala at the Langston estate. You will stand by my side, smile when you must, speak only when spoken to." Her stomach tightened. She had grown up on the edges of society's elite, but her family's fall from grace had left her unprepared to face the world again. She lowered her gaze, fingers curling in her lap, but his voice cut through her hesitation. "If you falter, Isabella, they will see weakness, and weakness is something I do not allow." The words struck like ice, but beneath them she caught a flicker in his eyes, as though he was testing her, watching to see if she would shatter or rise. She straightened her shoulders, her voice quiet but steady. "Then you should not have chosen me if weakness was what you feared." His jaw tightened, but instead of anger, something darker glimmered in his gaze. Curiosity again, mingled with the sharp edge of obsession. That evening, the gala glittered with chandeliers and polished laughter, the air filled with the scent of champagne and secrets. Isabella's nerves twisted as Adrian led her through the crowd, his hand firm at the small of her back. His touch burned through the fabric of her gown, steadying her even as it unsettled her. Whispers followed them, eyes darting with speculation. The ruthless CEO had married a woman so modest, so untouched by scandal, it seemed almost unbelievable. Isabella moved carefully, her polite smile hiding the storm within her. She felt like prey in a room full of predators. At the center of it all, Adrian stood tall, commanding respect with every glance. When one of his rivals, a man with a sly smile, approached and offered a mocking toast, Adrian's hand tightened protectively at Isabella's waist. "To the virgin bride," the rival said smoothly, his words dripping with poison. "May she civilize the untamable Blackwell." Isabella froze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The room seemed to hold its breath, but before she could retreat, Adrian's voice sliced through the tension, low and lethal. "Careful with your words. She carries my name now. Insult her, and you insult me." The rival's smirk faltered under Adrian's unyielding gaze. Isabella's heart pounded as Adrian raised her hand to his lips and pressed a deliberate kiss against her knuckles. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment, and the whispers turned into a storm. When they finally left the gala, the city night wrapping around them, Isabella could barely breathe. She felt both protected and trapped, desired yet claimed. Inside the car, Adrian leaned closer, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You are not as fragile as I thought. But do not forget, Isabella, this marriage may be a contract, but every eye is on us. From this moment on, you are mine to protect." His words should have reassured her, yet they carried a dangerous edge, a promise that blurred the lines of their agreement. As the car sped into the darkness, Isabella realized her world was shifting in ways she could no longer control, and Adrian, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, knew he had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just a contract, she was becoming an obsession. The weeks after the gala transformed everything between Adrian and Isabella. What began as a cold arrangement had become something else entirely, something Isabella could neither name nor control. She noticed the way his eyes followed her across a room, sharp and unrelenting, as though he was memorizing every movement she made. He was no longer simply the ruthless CEO who had bound her with a contract. He was a man circling closer and closer, breaking down walls she had thought unshakable. It began with the smallest things, a silk scarf appearing on her dresser, the exact shade she once admired in a shop window, though she had spoken of it to no one. A piano tuned in the east wing, though she had only once brushed her fingers across its keys. At dinners, Adrian no longer read his papers in silence. He watched her instead, asking questions about her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. His voice, once clipped and businesslike, now lingered with a quiet intensity that unsettled her more than his coldness ever had. Isabella tried to keep her distance. She reminded herself that this was all an act, a performance to strengthen Adrian's empire. Yet her heart betrayed her. Each time their hands brushed, each time his gaze lingered too long, she felt heat surge through her body, leaving her shaken. One evening, when a storm lashed against the mansion's glass walls, Adrian entered the library where she sat curled with a book. He moved like a shadow, silent yet commanding, and when she looked up, the firelight caught the sharp lines of his face. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you always hide when the world grows loud?" "I am not hiding," she said softly, closing her book. "I am simply choosing silence." A flicker of something dark crossed his eyes. He stepped closer, the storm raging behind him, and for the first time, Isabella saw not just the CEO, but the man beneath. The boy who had clawed his way out of a loveless childhood, who had built walls of steel to survive. His voice dropped, rough with honesty. "Silence was all I knew growing up. In this house, in my world, silence is dangerous. It means weakness." Her chest tightened. She had never expected vulnerability from him, not in this lifetime. Tentatively, she whispered, "Perhaps silence can mean peace too." He froze, as if no one had ever dared offer him such a thought. The tension in the air thickened, pulling them closer, until his hand brushed hers where it rested on the armrest. The touch was deliberate, testing, and Isabella's pulse raced. But before she could retreat, the library doors opened with a loud crack. A maid rushed in, breathless, with a message from the board. Adrian's rivals had begun whispering, doubting the marriage, questioning if Isabella was truly his wife or just a puppet. The Langstons were beginning to waver. Adrian's eyes darkened. "They think you are a weakness," he said, his voice edged with steel. Isabella swallowed hard, fear rising inside her. "What does that mean for us?" "It means," he said, stepping even closer until she could feel his breath against her skin, "that I have no choice but to prove them wrong." The storm outside raged louder, rattling the windows. Isabella's heart hammered as she looked up into his eyes, realizing he was no longer speaking about the board or the Langstons. He was speaking about her, about the pull between them that was tearing through every clause of their contract. And in that moment, Isabella understood the truth that terrified her most. Adrian Blackwell, the man who had vowed to keep her as nothing more than a contract bride, was beginning to unravel. And in his unraveling, she was becoming not just his wife in name, but the center of an obsession that might consume them both. The pressure around Adrian and Isabella reached a breaking point the night of the winter charity gala. The Langston family had extended the invitation themselves, but beneath the polished surface, it was clear this was not merely a social gathering. It was a test. Whispers had already spread through the boardrooms and the glossy pages of society columns. Was Isabella truly Adrian's wife, or was she a fragile ornament brought in to secu? Real Adrian could not win alone. Isabella stood before her mirror, her hands trembling as she fastened the delicate clasp of a borrowed necklace. The gown Adrian had chosen for her was elegant but bold, a deep crimson that made her pale skin glow like firelight. She had argued for something simpler, something less noticeable, but Adrian had insisted. His words echoed in her memory. "If they doubt you, show them they were wrong to ever question." When he appeared in her doorway, his gaze lingered too long, sharp and unguarded. For a moment, the ruthless CEO looked like a man struggling with something far more dangerous than business. Then the mask slipped back into place. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, though every part of her wanted to run. The gala glittered with chandeliers, the air heavy with champagne and secrets. Cameras flashed as Adrian led her into the ballroom, his hand firm at her waist. Isabella forced her smile, though the weight of every stare pressed like chains around her neck. They danced, they posed, they spoke with carefully chosen words. But the whispers followed them everywhere, sharper now, cutting deeper. It was during one of these whispered exchanges that Adrian's control began to crack. A board member's wife leaned close to Isabella with a smile too sweet to be kind. "You're prettier than I expected, though I imagine a man like Adrian must find such innocence rather boring." The words pierced her, leaving her breathless. Before she could retreat, Adrian was suddenly there, his presence like a storm. He pulled Isabella against him, his arms circling her waist with a possessive force that left no doubt. His eyes locked with the woman's, cold and merciless. "My wife is never boring," he said, his voice low enough to chill the blood. And then, before Isabella could process what was happening, Adrian lowered his head and kissed her. The ballroom froze. Cameras exploded in flashes of light. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce, claiming, shattering every line of the contract they had signed. Isabella's body went rigid in his arms, her heart hammering with shock and betrayal. She had trusted the rules, the boundaries that were meant to protect her, and now, in front of the entire city, Adrian had broken them without hesitation. When he finally released her, her lips burned, her mind spinning. She could see the triumph in the eyes of the press, the fascination in the Langstons, the envy in every rival. Adrian had proven his point. Their marriage looked real, undeniable, but Isabella's chest ached with a deeper truth. To the world, the kiss was power. To her, it was a breach of trust she could not ignore. The car ride home was filled with silence. Adrian's eyes flickered toward her in the dim light, but she stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. At last, she whispered, "You broke the contract." His jaw tightened. "I did what was necessary." Her voice trembled with anger and hurt. "Necessary for business or necessary for you?" The question lingered, raw and dangerous, cutting through the walls between them. Adrian said nothing, but his silence was louder than any confession. Isabella turned her face away, realizing that the man who had promised her protection had now become the man who could most easily destroy her. The days after the gala carried a silence heavier than any argument. Isabella avoided Adrian as much as possible, retreating into quiet corners of the mansion, seeking refuge in the library or the garden where the roses bloomed in careful order. Yet no matter where she went, she could feel his presence pressing in, an invisible weight that never let her forget the kiss that had shattered their fragile agreement. The world outside saw passion, devotion, proof of a perfect union, but inside her chest was a storm of betrayal and confusion. One evening, she found herself in the music room, her fingers hesitantly pressing the keys of the grand piano. The melody was broken and uneven, but it calmed her. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not since her family's home had been sold piece by piece to cover debts. The memory of those happier days made her eyes sting. She did not hear Adrian at first. He stood in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made the air tremble. When she finally noticed him, she froze, her hands hovering above the keys. "Play," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual command. She wanted to refuse, to remind him that he had taken away her choice at the gala, but something in his tone made her pause. Slowly, she played again, the notes filling the room with a haunting sound. When she finished, the silence returned, but it felt different now, charged with something unspoken. "That was beautiful," Adrian said, stepping closer. For the first time, his eyes did not look like weapons. They looked almost human. Isabella swallowed, uncertain how to respond. She expected another sharp remark, another order. Instead, he sank into the chair opposite the piano, his shoulders heavier than she had ever seen. "Do you know why I push, Isabella?" He leaned forward, his voice low, rough. "Because if I don't, I lose everything. My father built nothing but debt. My mother was too weak to fight for us. I was a child raised in silence, in hunger, in shadows. The only way I survived was by building walls so high no one could ever tear them down." Isabella's chest ached as she listened. This was not the Adrian the world whispered about. This was a man shaped by pain, by scars he refused to show anyone else. For the first time, she felt the distance between them shrink. She dared to whisper, You don't have to fight me. His eyes locked onto hers, and the intensity there made her heart race. For a moment, he looked as though he might reach for her, but before either of them could speak again, the door burst open. Isabella's cousin, Claire, entered unannounced, her smile sharp as glass. She carried the air of someone who knew too much. How touching, she said smoothly, her eyes darting between them. The ruthless Adrian Blackwell, bearing his soul to his contract bride. I wonder what the world would think if they knew this perfect arrangement wasn't quite so perfect after all. Isabella's blood ran cold. Claire had always been envious, always searching for a way to reclaim the wealth her branch of the family had lost. Now her smirk carried a dangerous promise. Adrian rose slowly, his gaze lethal, but Claire only laughed softly and stepped back into the shadows. When she was gone, Isabella's heart pounded with dread. Adrian's jaw was tight, his hands clenched. She realized then that their marriage was no longer just a contract. It had become a battlefield, and the enemy was no longer only outside. That night, as Isabella lay awake in her bed, she could not silence the echo of Adrian's confession or the threat hidden in Claire's smile. For the first time, she wondered if love and ruin might arrive hand in hand, and if she would have the strength to face either. The air between Adrian and Isabella had grown too thick to ignore. Every day was a tug-of-war between the rules of their contract and the fire threatening to consume them both. The storm Claire had hinted at lingered in Isabella's mind, yet her heart beat faster whenever Adrian entered the room. He had become more unpredictable. One moment, the ruthless CEO she had married for convenience. The next, a man who looked at her as though she was the only thing in his empire that mattered. It was late one night when the walls finally crumbled. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the mansion, thunder shaking the sky. Isabella wandered the halls in her silk robe, restless and unable to sleep. She found herself in the library, staring at the flames crackling in the fireplace. She thought she was alone until she felt the weight of his gaze. Adrian was there, leaning against the doorway, his tie undone, his eyes dark with something she could no longer mistake for business. "You should be asleep," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "So should you," she whispered, refusing to look away. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, until the firelight caught the sharp lines of his face. Isabella's breath quickened. She wanted to run, yet her feet refused to move. When he reached her, he didn't touch her right away. He only studied her, as though battling an invisible war inside himself. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "I tried to keep my distance. I tried to respect the boundaries you set. But every night, every hour, you're in my head. I can't stop thinking about you, Isabella." Her heart slammed against her ribs. The contract had been built on rules meant to protect her, yet here he was, unraveling them one by one. Her lips parted, but no words came. Adrian's hand rose, hesitating in the air before finally brushing her cheek. His touch was hot, burning her skin, pulling her closer to the fire of his obsession. "You don't understand what you've done to me," he whispered. "I built my world on control, but with you, I am losing it." Isabella trembled, torn between fear and a yearning she could no longer deny. When he lowered his head, his lips brushing hers lightly at first, she gasped, her body betraying her resistance. The kiss deepened, fierce and hungry, a collision of everything they had tried to bury. Her hands clutched his shirt, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed about the broken contract. Adrian lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the couch by the fire. The world outside raged with thunder, but inside the library, time seemed to stop. Isabella gave herself to him, trembling but unafraid. Every touch was a vow, every breath stolen between them, a reminder that this was no longer just a deal. When the storm finally eased, she lay against his chest. Her innocence surrendered, her heart caught in the dangerous truth. But outside the door, hidden in the shadows, Claire's eyes glittered with triumph. She had followed them, camera in hand, capturing every stolen kiss, every intimate moment. While Adrian and Isabella crossed the line into something real, Claire was already preparing to twist their love into a weapon. Isabella didn't know it yet, but the night she gave her heart to Adrian would also be the night that gave their enemies the power to destroy them both. The morning after their night by the fire should have been filled with quiet warmth, but instead, a storm of whispers swept through Adrian's empire. Headlines lit up the city with photographs that should have never existed. Adrian Blackwell, the untouchable CEO, locked in a passionate embrace with his contract bride. The images were grainy but damning, enough to spark rumors that Isabella had trapped him, that her innocence had been nothing more than bait to capture his fortune. Isabella sat in the dining room, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the news on her phone. Every headline stabbed at her chest, words like gold digger and scandalous bride burned into her skin. She could barely breathe when Adrian strode into the room, the paper clenched in his hand, his jaw set like stone. "Who did this?" she whispered, though deep down she already knew. "Claire," Adrian growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "She planned this. She wanted to break us apart." But the damage was already spreading. The Langstons, who had once considered Adrian's marriage proof of his stability, now questioned everything. Board members whispered in corners, wondering if the Blackwell empire had been compromised by a woman who didn't belong in their world. Isabella felt their judgment like knives in her back. She wanted to disappear, to protect Adrian from the chaos her presence had unleashed. At the emergency board meeting that afternoon, the room was thick with tension. Men in suits sat around the long table, their expressions hard, their voices cold. One of them leaned forward, his words dripping with disdain. "This marriage was supposed to strengthen us, Adrian. Instead, it has become a liability. You've allowed yourself to be manipulated by a girl who had nothing to offer but her name." Isabella's cheeks burned. She wanted to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. She had no power here, no voice. She could only sit in silence as the men picked apart her worth, reducing her to nothing more than a scandal in silk. Then Adrian rose from his seat. His eyes were lethal, his voice low but steady. "Enough. You forget who built this empire. You forget who made you rich. You dare to question me because of her." He turned, his gaze locking on Isabella, and for the first time in public he allowed the walls around his heart to fall. "She is not my weakness. She is the reason I am stronger than any of you." Gasps rippled through the room. The board members exchanged shocked glances. Adrian's confession was both a declaration and a warning. No one would touch Isabella without facing his wrath. Isabella's chest tightened as tears filled her eyes. He had shattered every rule of their contract again. But this time, not with a kiss or a touch. This time, he had given her something far more dangerous. He had given her his public loyalty, his obsession laid bare before the world. When the meeting ended, Adrian guided her out with his hand firm at her back. She tried to speak, to tell him she feared she had ruined everything for him, but he silenced her with a single look. "You are mine, Isabella," he whispered as the cameras flashed, "and I will burn this empire to the ground before I let them take you from me." She trembled at his words, caught between fear and love, unsure if his devotion was her salvation or the beginning of her undoing. Outside, the city roared with gossip and speculation, but the true war was just beginning, and Isabella knew she was at the very heart of it. The weight of the scandal pressed down on Isabella until she could no longer breathe inside Adrian's mansion. Every whisper in the press, every sharp glance from the board, every poisonous word from Claire replayed in her head until one truth grew louder than all the rest. She was destroying him. Adrian had spent his life building an empire of steel, and she had become the crack in its foundation. No matter how fiercely he defended her, the world would never accept that the ruthless Adrian Blackwell had chosen a woman like her for love. In the dead of night, Isabella packed her small suitcase. She moved quietly through the halls, her heart breaking with each step. She touched the piano where she had once played for him, the roses in the garden he had insisted be replanted for her, the library where she had surrendered both her innocence and her heart. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered a goodbye he would never hear. At dawn, she slipped into a waiting car, bound for the airport. The city beyond the glass looked blurred, her future uncertain, but her decision unshaken. Adrian would be free without her. She repeated the words like a prayer, though each one tore her apart inside. But Adrian Blackwell was not a man who let go of what was his. When he woke and found her gone, fury and panic collided inside him. His empire had faced hostile takeovers and betrayal, but nothing had ever terrified him like the thought of losing her. His men traced her to the airport within minutes. By the time Isabella reached the gate, Adrian was there, his presence crashing through the terminal like a storm. She froze when she heard his voice cut across the crowd. Isabella. The sound of her name on his lips stopped her more effectively than any chain could have. Slowly she turned, her suitcase trembling in her hand. His eyes were wild, his tie undone, his control stripped away. For the first time, the world saw not the polished CEO, but a man unraveling. "You can't leave me," he said, striding toward her. His voice was raw, desperate, carrying enough power to silence the onlookers. "You think you are a burden, but you are the only thing that keeps me standing." Her eyes filled with tears. "Adrian, they hate me. They think I ruined you." He stopped inches from her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his voice breaking with a truth he had never dared speak aloud. "Let them hate. Let them whisper. I have fought my entire life for control, for power, for respect, and none of it matters without you. Do you understand me? I don't want an empire if it costs me you." The terminal seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, his confession echoing through the silence. Isabella's heart pounded as she looked into his eyes, searching for lies. But there were none. For the first time, she saw Adrian stripped bare, his obsession transformed into something deeper, something terrifying and beautiful all at once. Her suitcase slipped from her hand. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "You broke every rule of our contract, and I will break them all again," he said fiercely, cupping her face in his hands, "because this was never a contract to me. It was the only way I could find you." Before she could answer, flashes of cameras lit up around them. Claire had struck again, releasing the photographs she had hidden. The scandal reignited in an instant, but this time Adrian didn't flinch. He pulled Isabella into his arms and kissed her with a passion that silenced every voice in the airport. She clung to him, torn between fear of the world and the undeniable truth in her heart. Whatever awaited them, there was no going back. She was no longer just his contract bride. She was the woman he would fight for, even if it meant burning the empire he had built. The fallout from the airport scene spread like wildfire. The world had witnessed Adrian Blackwell kiss his contract bride as though she were the only woman alive. The press called it reckless, dangerous, scandalous, but the images carried something that no amount of gossip could erase. The kiss was real, the obsession was undeniable, and that truth made Adrian's enemies desperate. Claire moved quickly, feeding more photographs and twisted stories to the media. She painted Isabella as a manipulator, a naive virgin who had trapped Adrian in her web. Yet behind her smile lurked a shadow she could not control. Adrian's investigators were already tearing through her finances, tracing her sudden wealth, and what they uncovered was far darker than jealousy. Claire had not acted alone. She had been paid by one of Adrian's greatest rivals, a man who had been circling Blackwell Enterprises for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The revelation hit during the next board meeting. Adrian entered with Isabella by his side, his presence like a storm that could no longer be contained. Claire was there too, her expression smug, confident she had already won. She leaned forward with her poisoned words, telling the board that Adrian had lost control, that Isabella had ruined him, that the empire was crumbling. But Adrian's voice cut her down with lethal precision. "Do you know what happens to pawns?" "Claire," he said, his eyes narrowing. "They are sacrificed long before the game is over." With a flick of his hand, documents were laid across the table, photographs, bank records, and messages that tied Claire directly to his rival. Gasps filled the room as the truth spread like fire. The betrayal was complete, the evidence undeniable. Claire's smirk faltered, her face pale as she realized her game had collapsed. Security moved forward, and for the first time, Claire's laughter broke, high and desperate, as she was escorted out. The rival who had funded her schemes was exposed publicly the next morning. His shares plummeted, his name dragged through every headline. Adrian had turned the scandal into a weapon, and instead of destroying him, it had made him untouchable. But Isabella knew the real victory wasn't in the empire. It was in the way Adrian's hand never left hers, the way his eyes sought her even when the world was watching. That evening, with the city lights burning beyond the windows, Adrian led her to the same library where everything between them had changed. No contracts lay between them now, no carefully drawn rules. He stood before her, his walls finally shattered, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard. "I built this empire on control, Isabella, on rules, on power, on fear. And I thought that would be enough. But then you walked into my life, and you destroyed everything I thought I knew. You are not my weakness. You are my strength." Her heart pounded, tears stinging her eyes. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. With a deep breath, he opened it, revealing a ring that glimmered in the firelight. "I don't want a contract. I don't want appearances. I want forever. Marry me, Isabella, not as part of a deal, but as the only woman I will ever love." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they had endured. Isabella's breath shook as she lifted her gaze to his, her voice trembling, but certain. "Yes." Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in his life, the ruthless CEO allowed himself to feel peace. He pulled her into his arms, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that carried no conditions, no rules, no end date. The world outside still whispered, still doubted, but it no longer mattered. Adrian Blackwell had found the one thing he could never control and never let go of. Isabella Hart was no longer his contract bride. She was his wife, his partner, his obsession turned into love. And as he held her, whispering against her lips that there would be no exit clause this time, Isabella realized that what had begun as a desperate bargain had become the only truth she would ever need. Forever,